Imagine you're weeding a garden and you're not doing it because you really care about it. You're doing it just because you don't want to get in trouble. And so when you're weeding it, you don't do a particularly good job. You pull off the tops of the plants, but you don't dig down to the roots. Because at the end of the day, the person who's making you weed the garden won't notice the difference. But it will be different. The weeds will come back really quickly if you don't get down to the roots. The first thing you would need to do is expose the roots. Figure out where the roots are, expose them, and then get them out. You might also, at a certain point in that process, think that you're dealing with separate plants that have separate roots, and then as you uncover things, realize that they actually have a common root. So now imagine that the garden is what one of my favorite living philosophers, Charles Eisenstein, calls the more beautiful world we know, or the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And imagine that that's the world that you want to create. And the weeds are the various forms of oppression that we've been talking about throughout this course. Sexism, environmental injustices, and racism. We've been talking about all these things throughout the course, and it might seem like they're all separate plants and need to be attacked differently. We've seen in a variety of ways that we can think about them all, nevertheless, as having a common root. And the common root that we've identified and really explored is what we've been calling hierarchical dualism. The movement of that Karen Warren represents as working within is known as eco-feminism or ecological feminism. And on one level, it's just a sort of recognition, like, oh, we thought that these were separate plants. We thought that environmental problems and feminist problems were separate issues. We thought that environmental degradation and patriarchy were separate problems to be attacked separately. And then the movement of ecological feminism is just saying that, invited us to consider the possibility that they actually have a common root. The other thing that's really interesting to me that we're going to explore as we get into Karen Warren's analysis is that she doesn't limit her analysis in many ways that we have, to a kind of logical, analytical understanding of what she calls the roots of domination. She'll do that for the first part of the paper. But as the paper goes on, things start to look a little bit different, and she starts to take on discourses that don't necessarily come so naturally to the Western philosophical tradition. In particular, she's going to talk about ways of being in the world, attitudes, styles, as really the fundamental way in which we are, but also she'll make the case that the roots of these various forms of domination that we see in the world aren't so much like an ideological commitment to metaphysical dualism, although it's part of it. Really fundamental is just a fundamental way of being in the world. And she presents these two possibilities following another ecofeminist philosopher, Marian Fry. And those two possibilities, it's kind of like, I like to think about them as like polarities on a spectrum, or endpoints on a spectrum. On one side, we have arrogance, and on the other side, we have love.